was thinking about the fact that Dick has come to read here and Cole to dance, and remembering that I read with him some years ago, and when I did, I read a little portion of a short story I was working on, and I decided that I would read the finished story tonight. I've had some trouble with the title. Originally, I called the story Queen Wilhemina's Mines. As some of you know, I came from Butte, Montana, my hometown. An old Irish ghetto in a way, and a strange town filled with a kind of understanding of suffering, I think, that is unusual. And I went back over there to reacquaint myself with the place last week. And not to make too much of being Irish, I'm glad that Seamus Heaney won the Nobel Prize. I think he's a good poet. He writes about crossroads. He knows that knowledge and experience somehow have to do with crossroads. And I guess in a sense, my life takes on some kind of development as a result of knowing that too. Anyway, I've come to call this story a number of different things. Once I thought, Far From Euphoria, that's what I'll call it. Then I said, no, that's too cute. And I saw a postcard that a friend of mine, an artist in Butte, did called The Last Resort. And I kind of like that, since I live down here in the last best place. If you were born a man and you lived beneath the sky, where would you go if a wind came by? Would you go to the meadow where the buttercups grow, or would you put on your cap and your carbide lamp, take your pick and dig in the earth in a dark, dark hole for somebody else, for the kings and the queens who are in control of the darkness below, the law above, and the treasure that lets them live in the meadow where the flowers grow, and play golf in Phoenix, Arizona. Oh, his mind, before it was lost, was a literate, thoughtful mind. A literate, thoughtful mind. Dr. Van Smeel gave me a month's supply of meds, a full bottle, compliments of the state, he smiled, pulling at his shapely beard. Schizophrenia laced with definite ingrained traits of paranoia, he added during the pre-release interview, his frown the concentrated look of a chemist identifying the contents of a murky retort, complicated by abnormal initiative. He peered at me as though bored by often used diagnosis, and repeated it. Abnormal initiative. Will I get better? I had foolishly asked. A quiver in my voice, something that made him smile, the comfortable smile of a realist. I tried to steady my foot, to keep it from tapping methodically, the tremor a side effect of the tranquilizer, along with a tinny taste of alum, which formed upon taking the medication as tiny white flecks in the corner of my mouth, making me look like I munched continuously on Rolaids. A line of a song went through my brain. Lately, things keep doing that, sometimes invented, sometimes remembered. Babies learn to walk in the circles of the sun, walk in the circles of the sun. Irony and put down in my heart. Fragments of attempted understanding slipping through my browbeaten brain. The dark convictions of a communist at heart. In a time of unbridled libertarian economics and yuppie self-congratulation, nursery rhyme seemed profound. Better, he asked, methodically, as though the question was egregious. Health, especially mental health, is very relative, as are all conditions of health. As a matter of fact, I have to take cortisone shots in my foot, for instance," he went on, lifting his leg and wagging his polished wingtips as though showing off his shoes. Fancy shoes, burgundy brown, smooth. Van Smeel had caught his toes in a power lawnmower the summer before. You could tell as he looked at his foot that it was an unpleasant memory, maybe even frightening, because he smiled again. He smiled often, but sadly his acceptance of suffering, the price he paid for deep understanding. He looked a final time at his wagging shoe, then swiveled his desk chair and peered lazily out of the window into the cloudy gloom of the wintry day, the mist rising over the duck ponds of the hospital grounds below his office, thinking wise thoughts, I supposed, though maybe merely daydreaming or yearning for spring and the warmer sun that would burn away the fog and green up the grounds, or clear away the snow from the long, cold western road, so he could whiz away in his brand new red Porsche. I waited politely to hear what he might say, embarrassed that my foot tapped the floor uncontrollably, as though telegraphing messages to the grim zombies who trudged along the lime green corridors of the deeper reaches of the cracker box of a state building, the moneyless victims of a failing economy, the unadjusted members of a negative utopia, locked out of sight, swept under an expensive rug, as it were. He turned suddenly then, looked sharply into my face, like a cat who had heard the sound of a mouse under a sofa, causing me to recross my legs nervously, to change the position of my stuttering foot. I felt like Huck Finn must have felt in the scene in which the old lady threw the ball of yarn to him when he was on his way to his own funeral, and when she did, discovered that since he snapped his legs shut to catch the ball, he was a boy dressed in a girl's outfit, a boy in drag, on the way to his own funeral, trying to escape from snivelization, but wanting a final look before he boarded the raft, headed down the river that ran through the slave-owning rapids of the culture toward an escape into a place of simple acceptance, a greedless place without slaves or masters. I kept my eyes steady, however, knowing that shifty eye movement was indicative of paranoia, deep ingrained paranoia that showed almost no matter what, like ring around the collar. I didn't want the keeper of the keys to know me as a Huck. Careful, 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 my mind intoned inwardly. This may be Pap in disguise. You were intensely psychotic when you entered the hospital, he said. Quite psychotic, he muttered grimly into the pile of papers on his desk. I think I needed vitamins, I said. You are in need of much more than that. He laughed harshly, not in the least amused, his mouth open like a man about to take a bite of pie. I remembered the confusion of gowns and nurses and thought he was probably right. But I didn't smile, only shreds of realism left, but a dim knowledge of Puritanism lurking in his language sobered me, and my thumping foot froze, and I stiffened like a sinner in the hands of an angry God. He looked at me as one might look at a disposable razor. A grim disgust showed through. His longing for the open road grew stronger, I guessed, since again he looked yearningly out of the window. Psychotic, I blurted. Somebody at my foot. Quite psychotic, he replied, his mouth as tight as a gambler's, showing only a trace of insincerity born of the knowledge that he was playing with a stacked deck, marked cards, Socratic, calm, waiting for me to raise the ante or pass, to choose the appropriate attitude, his feline eyebrows arched, his face suddenly wearing the expression of a sadistic barman holding up a bottle of choice whiskey in front of a drunk who hasn't had a drink in months. Psychotic, he said, looking right at me, but not seeing me, knowing such darkness was potentially every man's, and that it was his curse and his genius to know that. That's true, isn't it? I smiled. I allowed myself to smile on, somewhat sadly to myself, drinking at his words, the inescapable fountain of choice conclusions, benign and reasonable. He held all of the cards, the degrees, and the keys. The keys, the keys, the money, the scrolls of authority hanging on his walls. He smiled broadly again, 2 gold fillings reflecting light in the back of his mouth, laser blips in a video game. He scooted his chair into his desk impatiently and sighed as he picked up his pen to fill in the forms the computer had supplied, a signal that I had passed the test. Would most assuredly, a phrase he hung on to, most assuredly be released at the end of the 90-day term. Unless, he added, shaking his head sadly, looking at his injured foot, unless psychotic thought disorders return. He hesitated. I do not believe that will happen as long as you continue on your medication. He smiled as though he had handed me a gift. Each day the orderly handed me the watery orange juice and the pills and watched me. The medication is at its optimum. The effect is satisfactory. It is not a cure, I am sorry to say, merely a palliative, but I advise you to treat your prescription as a diabetic would treat insulin, something you must get used to taking for the rest of your life. The rest, what's left, I mean, the rest of my life, I asked, my foot hammering away, da, 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 on the floor. Health bells, man, Dr. Van Smeel said, fed up with my whimpering. Pay attention now. Look at me when I am talking to you. Before these drugs were available, a man in your condition would likely spend most of his life in the back wards of a hospital, just driftwood. He tapped his pen. Tappity tap. The sound mixing in my ear like a snare drum, backing up the dull bass thump of my foot on his rug. This man made over $100,000 a year. I wanted to cry out that his conclusion was not acceptable. But once before I had said something like that, and he had then talked of electroshock treatments, had even closed one eye, I recalled. Seeing me jerking against the leather straps, I guessed, perhaps smelling the familiar odor of burning hair. Now I nodded quickly. The man who had heard the sound of one hand clapping. Van Smeel leaned back in his chair, built a little church with his hands, smiled over the little church and said, I'm glad you understand. Behave yourself now. I will see you once more before you leave us. I nodded again and hoped that my smile did not make me look entirely inscrutable or slammed in the face with a cookie cutter. Thank you, sir, I said, bowing my way out of the door. If you lived under the sky and a wind came by and a wind came by, where would you go? What would you do? Would you go to the meadow where the buttercups grow? Would you go? Would you go? He did see me again. At the end of the 90-day period, he shook my hand in a manly way and he said, good luck. He patted my shoulder as though I might have once been a good guy. And here I am, back in my hometown, a dyed-in-the-wool mental case, a schizophrenic with ingrained traits of paranoia, complicated by a manic depressive switcheroo, having rented a cheap room in the Roost, as the Potter Hotel is called, a place where down-and-outers rent shabby, genteel rooms and use their tea bags over and over again, setting the wet ones on unpaid hospital bills. The rest of my life, I thought, as I sipped the tea in my small room, trying to keep my foot steady, somewhat glad to be back. Butte, Montana, known throughout the country as the richest hill on earth one time, a lusty, famous boomtown for 60 years, now inhabited by the survivors of the Anaconda Mining Company's pullout. A poor man's town, though the green stain of copper is everywhere seen on the scar face of the hills, a kind of puky cuprite, peacock stain. The copper itself is gone, though, and the kings have left to establish royalties in other lands, to bask in the sandboxes in Arizona. There were other people in the hotel who I knew would welcome me were I to knock on their doors, but experience in Butte has taught me a healthy regard for solitude. I have begun to understand the coyote who trots along carefully outside of the main stream, light-footed and alone. When I first got out of the hospital, I became acquainted with an ex-shaft boss whose wife had died of cancer and who had been laid off when the company pulled out. He invited me up to his room, but when I arrived, I found him sitting morosely at the kitchen table in front of a half-empty fifth of early times, and a .45 in his sunburned hand. The trembles. My hands began to sweat. My alum-tasting mouth hardly able to work since he held the gun against his head all the time he listened to me try and talk him down. My tongue a swollen lump, doing its best to answer the theodicy to his satisfaction. Think of the rest of us. God, just don't. I saw I was losing him as his finger tightened on the blue blade of the trigger, and in my imagination, which was active as always, I heard the gun roar and saw his brains splatter the kitchen wall like a plate of kidney stew. The .45 simply clicked dryly. I opened my eyes, my foot jumping like a Mexican bean, my heart flipping like a hooked trout. He was doubled up in silent, mad laughter. The gun had been empty. Then there was the pimply-faced girl in room 29. She always waved at me coyly, a shy butterfly wave. And when I stopped to chat one day, she invited me in to share a supper of Spam and eggs and talked of her life's ambition, which was to become a belly dancer, a fact she emphasized by sticking out her belly. She said she was mostly Greek, you know, and did a whirling pirouette that displayed the fact that she had on no panties. Some kind of Greek invitation, I thought. But she screamed when I put my hand on her knee while we were sitting on the couch. And then she grabbed me around the legs as I made my way toward the door, saying, give it to me, like a heroin addict in a melodrama, and did not let go of my leg until I had dragged her clear into the hallway. Finally, she lost her grip, and she yelled desperately, you fairy, you fruitcake, the words rebounding in my ears as I toddled quickly down the hall. After that, I decided to stay in my room and cultivate to listen to NPR on the radio, and to dream. I dream a lot. I have to cope with depression. Even though my sleep is interrupted by weird human noises, sometimes moaning sounds coming through the walls from other rooms and other dreamers, mixing infernally with the sounds of wheezing steam radiators and the creaking of old dry wood squeezed by sub-zero weather, solitude, cult, and clar. I was never really alone, though. Once I heard a baby crying, though children were not allowed in the roost. And once, well past midnight, a tra-la-la-la-la ditty floated over my transom, followed by a bumpity-bump grind on the door. Dreams poured from my soul like maple syrup from a tapped tree. I kept a journal, thinking maybe the Jungians were right to consider dreams the cornerstones of the personality, and that they should be handled sensitively as fragile hatchlings, destined to lead a psyche to its potential, or to life-saving realizations, perhaps to the meaning in living. But my dreams were mundane and beyond analysis, even dull. So, for instance, I dreamed several times of having lost my favorite dish rag. The attendant anxiety was as great as if someone close to me had died. I was discouraged with introspection. One night, though, I dreamed of grape vineyards and peach orchards and a coast of sea-white sand combed flat and white, where I walked holding hands with my two little girls when they were little girls. A beach that was private and real and for a little while all ours, though it was a scary dream since it ended with a hurricane sucking up the vast blue ocean into a great twist of porpoises, dolphins, sperm whales, out of which appeared the face of a sad clown playing a tiny violin, reminiscent of the fool in La Strada. Another night I dreamed of being in a boxing ring with an opponent who was only a shadow, but whose punches were headaches, whose eyes were pupilless black holes, whose head shook with some kind of motor ataxia, someone out of a flickering, violent TV show, a Cybex projection, a cheap Gothic number. When I would awaken from such a nightmare, I would write down as quickly as I could the central themes and symbols of the dreams, hoping to catch the drift of meaning from such productions as though they were clues. Nightmares made me see signs that I hoped the conscious intelligence could follow, like a detective tracking a mystery. Find a way to get your shit together, Van Smeel used to say, shocking his timid patience with his frank vulgarity. The dreams that seemed most personal were dreams of working underground in the mines, holes that many of my relatives had mulled about in over the years, the copper mines, far below the surface dwellings of the town, deep underground where no trace of sunshine found its way, where echoes began, never ended, where miners dropped into the black shafts on a cage at the speed of 100 feet a second with a slippery sound as the skids accepted the iron rails, mixing with the sighs of the men trying to accept their fate, dropping at the end of a thick steel cable into the black, damp darkness. There were animals in these dreams. A large tram mule figured prominently. He had come from the old days, a time when 35,000 miners had toiled 3 shifts a day around the clock, hoisting ore from 48 black iron head frames. I knew this because he wore on his head an old-fashioned carbide lamp, a great brass lantern that blazed incandescently. Oddly enough, he smoked a cigar and he talked. His voice sounded like the voice of my father who had died in the high ore. He sounded like a wise homunculi, a term I had heard a mystical Irish mucker use to describe the friendly spirits who looked out for the poor miner. A great worker who knew the stopes and raises of the night, curling his lip and rolling his stogie as he pulled heavy loads down endless tunnels, keeping his eyes on the working earth of the hard-hanging walls. I wondered why he reminded me of my lost father. I remembered my father, though, and I remembered him saying, a man doesn't need work, he needs money. Last night, the mule was there again, his nostrils smoking, the brass lantern casting an eerie glow in the darkness, shining in the sweat beads of the country rock, a tiny encased image in every bead, a smoking mule face in every pearl of mine damp. Looking for a ride? He asked, pawing the football with his right foreleg, his iron-shod hoof clanging against a rusty rail. Where could you take me? I stammered in sync with my jumpy foot. Where could you take me? Would you like to meet a queen? He asked kindly, his cigar drooping a bit, his eyes cozy and inviting. A queen? How could there be a queen down here? I was embarrassed and incredulous, and I tried hard to wake up. The mule fixed me with his great eyes and held me in my sleep. He said, she holds court on the 3600 of the Never Sweat. Queen Wilhemina, the cartel queen of copper. He swished his tail impatiently. She always comes on Thursday. No, I said. No, I guess not, in a hesitant voice. I don't think so. I'm afraid of women, especially royal women. You have to get to know her if you work down here, he leered. Why? Because this place, he rocked his head and the lamplight spread up and down the drift, because this place is hers. It is the last best place. She goes naked here. I'm not fond of royalty, dark or white, I said, dressed or bare-assed. He looked at me with what seemed to be renewed interest. I could take you to a Trappist monastery. Dolefully sounding even more like my father, who often teased me, something maddening in my youth, but a source of wise delight in my aging memory. I picked up a shred of courage. Is it a drinking order? I asked. Yes. They meet when the shift bosses aren't looking, but no one talks there. They simply drink and pray, he said, walking around in a tight circle, his lamp chasing shadows up and down the green hanging wall. Drink and pray, he intoned as he turned round and round in the narrow drift, bobbing his head up and down, puffing his cigar, blowing twin smoke rings from his flaring nostrils. Aren't there any other choices? I asked. We could go to an icebox stove, but it's so cold there. So cold, he said with an ironic, slipping diphthong. I awakened, shivering, trying to pull the wool army blanket over my head, aware of the winter light leaking coldly through the single tiny window in my room, wondering how I could have dreamed such a dream. Then I got up and hurriedly made a few notes and dressed in my heavy mackinaw, thinking that a walk in the wintry sunshine of the old ghost town would give me a clearer sense of it all. The bottle of meds sat on the dresser. You must take these for the rest of your life, Van Smeal had said. I grabbed them and poured them down the drain. I left the room then like a man who leaves the scene of a crime he was glad to commit, satisfied but scared. I walked down Park Street. A pigeon walked along in front of me, right down the sidewalk, as artless as could be. Walk, 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 past the parking meters that the town fathers had beheaded to make the old uptown area more accessible to those who preferred it over the slick convenience of the shopping mall and the flats. The 19th century buildings leaned over the street, proclaiming their faded charms as if located in an open-air museum. Merchants smiled ingratiatingly from the doorways. The few neon signs still left began to blink on as the sun set. A couple of bookstores, an antique shop, a jewelry shop, an essay office, and the Seven Sisters, a bar I sometimes dropped into mostly because of Catherine, who was called Cat by people who really knew her. A bartender I liked, a swarthy woman with hard eyes whose laugh was genuine. In her spare time, she worked with a backstrap loom, worked on patterns and weavings that she had learned living on the Navajo reservation. There was some kind of kindness in her. It was not sentimental. She patted my hand after I paid for my drink, and it wasn't the kind of a pat I had gotten from the doctor, nor from the nurses. How come? I asked. I haven't seen you in a while, that's all, she said with a wan smile. What have you been up to? I wanted to say something that didn't sound like Bogart, but meant, as all of his lines meant, sleep with me, baby. And yet something that meant something more than that, too. But my foot banged the bar rail telegraphically, and I sipped my drink, feeling like a blue heeler watching a raccoon in a tree, as I saw the cleavage of her shapely breasts beneath the cotton blouse, the curve between the firm cheeks of her hearty rear end as she bent over to get a bottle from the cooler, her supple sensuality pulling at my drugged libido. You live in the Roost, don't ya? A red-faced man, the only other customer in the bar, asked. My paranoia turned on. Dim headlights on the black highway of dreams and frustrating encounters. Topside as well as underground. The fear of cave-ins, the sound of a cracking headboard, the squeak of a wedge. I finished the drink quickly and looked for a getaway line, preparing to dismount from the stool, the longed-for furry feeling I was beginning to feel slipping away, the quicksilver quality of love turning into stone, cold stone. I smiled in the face of adversity. Yes, I confessed I was one of them, a rooster of some kind. I wished I could crow. Yeah, I said. Got to get back to the coop. Short leash, I said, pulling out an imaginary strap around my neck, gratified to see Cat grin as I edged out the door, grinning myself, knowing I was a condemned chicken, headed for the steam cookers of some kind of weird fast food industry, or the cops, the great poultry killers in the yard, the hidden hawks. Murphy's Hotel, as the town jail was called, was where the red-faced man thought I probably belonged. He looked disappointed that I hadn't waited for him to insult me or give me a little speech about ne'er-do-wells and floaters and cop-outs and frauds and freaks and fools and environmentalists and so on. I'd heard it all. The society was full of self-appointed watchdogs. I walked along the broken sidewalks to the hotel, held a bit by the memory of a man's accusatory inward-folding eyes. I walked slowly, thinking of scenes in Dostoevsky's novels, scenes of expected and unexpected punishment, waiting at the end of cobblestone streets, black iron gallows frames, empty houses, garbage in the alleyways, scruffy cats, and empty bottles. My room was a sanctuary as well as a cell. I did not know whether I had been wise to leave it or not. The drugs were wearing thinner and thinner, and my foot was becoming ominously quiet. The little wee hop was still there, but it was weaker, like a baby rabbit. I took off my shoes, wondering if it would stick a furry nose out into the room and test the air. I laughed a little. Reality was so much more absurd than madness. Psychotic breaks had become normal for me. They were protestations set up to set me free of other people's cherished ways, an insistence upon the irrational in life, seen in the light of eternity. My mind was a violent force within, and something in me rejected everyone else's morality as self-serving. I knew each of us is alone. I got up and I found my journal and I wrote, "Don't be afraid. It doesn't do any good. There's no reason to fear the universe." I laid down then and I dozed, and the mule showed up. "So you've decided to work in the mines?" he asked. Then he sang a bar or two of the old song, "If you were a man under a sky and the wind came by and the wind came by, where would you go? Would you go to the meadow where the buttercups grow, or would you get your cap and your carbide lamp and your pick and dig in a dark, dark hole?" "There's no answer to nursery rhyme," I exclaimed. "It's all in how the ground breaks," he said. "A matter of how you drill the round." The cigar glowed. For a moment he looked, not like my father, but like Dr. Van Smeel. "How do you figure it out?" I asked. "You can't," he said, shifting his stogies sagaciously. "I like a star cut myself." The smoke from his cigar curled slowly from his great nostrils in those two thin blue-white streams. "It is possible to slip up. The truth is there, behind the face of rock. But if the touch of the bit is wrong, and the rock shatters along a bad line, it's dust to dust, my boy. Dust to dust. You'd better take your medicine." I laughed again, and I heard myself, and I knew I was waking up. The mule moved back in the darkness. I heard a knocking on my room door, a steady, brave knock. "Whole carats of starlight can be lost in the twinkle of an eye," the mule warned as he disappeared. "Remember, there is no room for hope in a good plan. No room at all." I was myself suddenly, and without a plan, but fully awake, wondering if at the sound of that door, if that sound was at last a knock I could answer. Thank you.